everyone, this is my friend Han. He's a PhD candidate at Duke University. He's previously worked at Neuralink and a bunch of up-and-coming biotech startups. We're going to talk about tech and what's going on in the industry.
They can't even see what we're drinking.
I'm drinking matcha lattes.
There, yes.
Yay. Okay, what do you think about tech layoffs recently?
Tech layoffs. I think it's a necessary adjustment. Mainly this comes from the Fed raising interest rates. When you raise interest rates to something like 4 or 5%, that changes all the financial models downstream. So now for companies, like company bonds, in order to borrow money, you would have to give a much better return than the Fed. The Fed is the risk-free return rate benchmark. That's the Fed interest rate. So companies, when they borrow money, have to give returns of, say, 10% or something around there. And then startups, in order to get investor money, early stage startups would have much more risk, would have to give returns somewhere like in the neighborhood of like probably 20% or higher. So it's very hard to do for a lot of startups. And so that's why a lot of startups have to stop growing, stop scaling, and cut back on expenses and just try to hunker down and survive. And what that means is they'll be cutting staff. So it's kind of a natural result of increasing interest rates. I think a lot of tech, has like workers that they're not utilizing very efficiently, and they were paying very high salaries for, but not getting much labor out of it, much useful productivity out of it. Yeah. So the return on salary was low, and during bad times, businesses have to tighten their belt and adjust. And typically what that means is finding areas of inefficiency and cutting that out. And so that's what we're seeing. So overall, I think it is going to be like whatever comes out on the other side will be healthier tech companies than what we had previously.
Are you worried about being laid off? And should other people worry?
I'm not personally worried. My company is hardware, not software. We do nanotechnology stuff, and typically investors that invest in those sort of companies have a much longer time horizon. So we have enough runway that I'm not super worried about being laid off. If I were in, say, the SaaS space, software as a service, or other sorts of like software areas where you depend a lot on subscriptions, I would be pretty worried. It's just the nature of cutting costs is that a lot of subscription services are the first to go.
But they're not that expensive, right?
They can be quite expensive. It really depends on what the subscription is.
A lot of people will comment, I hope you didn't get laid off.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, why would I get laid off? I work at the thing that has higher net worth than all the other things.
Higher market cap.
Higher market cap.
Yeah.
And worth. And then one of my subscribers sent me a TikTok that I'll insert it in the video.
Yeah.
He was talking about if Elon can operate Twitter with just 50 employees, then everyone else in tech should be worried because all the other tech companies are going to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And then I texted him back. I was like, well, isn't this what every company does? They try to cut costs all the time. But they still need people. There's a certain amount of being cheap that's efficient, and then there's a certain amount of spending money to get stuff done. I feel like it's fear. People are just running on this fear train all the time.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would challenge is the numbers. I think Twitter's engineering staff is in the thousands. I think they have 7,500 employees. Elon's cut half. And I'm guessing out of the 7,000, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 is engineers. Still just unclear how many people have agreed to stay on at Twitter, given the ultimatum that Musk gave, if you're going to stay, you're going to have to be working very hardcore. Now, should staff at other companies be worried? It really depends, right? So if your company has a viable product, and the next iteration of the product is many years out, I would be pretty worried, because a cost-cutting measure is, if it's something many years out, then a cost-cutting measure could be to just can that project, cut that project, kill it, and lay off all the staff. If your company doesn't have a product and its only kind of business model depends on finishing that product, then I think you'll be fine. It really depends on where your company is at and what product you're working on. But I would expect more layoffs to come across the industry.
What do you do to not get laid off?
I mean, I guess you try to be
more valuable.
you try to make yourself indispensable. You try to be a good engineer, whatever that means in your company. The important thing is to realize that single layoffs, that might have some stronger correlation towards your own aptitudes, but mass layoffs typically have nothing to do with your skills. It has much more to do with the unit you're in. So the project that you're on is just no longer valuable to the company, or is just like, in terms of opportunity cost, it just makes sense to cut that one first. If you're trying to avoid being laid off, it would probably be wise to consider what kind of project you're on and how necessary that is to the company. But ultimately, I think part of the risks of working in tech is that there may be a downturn, and these businesses are more risky than a lot of other sectors. And I'm talking about startups and kind of mid-sized companies, not the very giant companies like Microsoft and Google. Although even there, we've seen massive layoffs.
I feel like if you're a good engineer, you've covered all the edge cases for yourself. You've developed skills in a bunch of areas.
Yeah.
And you have like a niche skill that you're core really good at. And then you have your finances in order. So that you have like an emergency fund. During the months you need to find another job, you should be set if you actually have thought about all the edge cases.
Yeah, I think that as a tech worker right now, if you're fresh out of school, that's a bit of a different situation because you might have massive amounts of student debt. But for someone that's been out of school for many years, your high salary, if you were wise, you should have built yourself a little bit of a safety buffer so that during a downturn you'd be able to survive for like 3 or 6 months without a job. On a typical tech worker salary, that's very doable, even if you live in the Bay Area. Where it gets a bit more difficult is if you're not a U.S. citizen and you're here on the H-1B, there's kind of an additional problem where if you get laid off and there's a whole sector downturn, so the whole industry is no longer hiring, it's very hard not to be going back home. If you're not here on a visa, you should be able to weather this. And if you cannot weather this, then you have to be flexible and adaptable and try to go find other work. Maybe take a salary cut.
I got this really mean comment yesterday.
Oh.
Yeah, this person, her username looks like a woman's username, but I'm just going to refer to them as like they. They said something like, oh, another pretty face on YouTube that just pretends to be a software engineer and like lies to people, pretends to code. I want to know your thoughts on that, but my thoughts are, it's like these people live under a rock. Like, do they not see like women in engineering? Like, if you work at any huge tech company, there's plenty of women software engineers. Not as much as like men, but there's plenty.
Yeah.
And there's like women in all sorts of STEM fields. There's doctors, there's female scientists, there's like architects, there's like, and it's like these people are just like in awe of me being a software engineer.
Well, it sounds like, obviously, it sounds very bitter. It sounds like she doesn't really believe you're a software engineer, right? If she's saying that you're pretending to code.
It's like I can't even, like, I work at a huge tech company. I can't share anything confidential.
Yeah.
Like, all of my work is confidential, so what am I going to do? Like, show you my screen?
I can confirm to everyone right now she's an actual software engineer. She knows how to code. She actually works at Apple.
And this is coming from a PhD candidate who's also a software engineer.
Well, not the conventional software, more automation software, but yes, more on the mechatronic side, mechanical and electrical. So a comment like that, I would just dismiss it. She's got the facts of the situation wrong, right? If you actually know how to code, you actually are a software engineer. So already her statement is false, and so it has lost credibility at that point. It sounds like she has an issue with having a pretty face as well. I don't know what that's about, but
what's wrong with that? And people will be like, oh, you just like got into tech because someone was thirsty. And I'm like, do you know how many rounds of interviews I have to get through with different interviewers to like pass my tech interviews?
Yeah.
That would have to be like 10 people I would have to get past. And if those people were judging me based on my looks, why don't they just hire a supermodel? These idiots on the internet just make me want to pause making YouTube videos.
Yeah. Well, I think you should keep doing what you're doing and just ignore these people. It is actually possible to be attractive and also a software engineer, right? So it's unfortunately sometimes it's not out of thirst that they hire attractive people. It's just they're competent and also attractive. So what are you going to do? If they're competent, you would hire them, right? And that's what you pick up on during the interviews. Typically, when you interview at a big tech firm, it's not one interviewer, it's like a panel of interviewers. And so even if somebody was thirsty, there would be other people on that panel that would challenge that. And there probably is a couple people that are kind of very anti pretty faces. They kind of want to make sure that this is not just another pretty face, that they actually know what they're doing. So more skeptical.
Yeah.
And
it's not like I look like this every day at work. Like, this is like for YouTube.
Yeah.
Tech interviews are pretty hard, and people will judge you based on how well you solve the problem. And the reason why I look good for YouTube and the internet is because I feel like everyone thinks software engineers just look like not that great, and so I'm just trying to change that.
Yeah.
And people just think I'm promoting that, if you have a pretty face, then you can become a software engineer. No, that's not what I'm promoting. I'm promoting you can look good and be a software engineer at the same time. Some people just are horrible. You think we live in a tech bubble or they live under a rock?
I think the truth is probably more nuanced than either of those two. Typically, people that try to bring others down, they have some insecurities about themselves. Perhaps they're a tech worker and they've never felt that attractive personally. They have some body image issues, and so that insecurity, kind of works its way into their comments. I don't think that necessarily they're living under a rock. Typically, people that live under a rock, I don't think YouTube would recommend your videos to. I also don't think there's a tech bubble. It's kind of hard to say if it's a bubble because there is clearly real value from tech, such as the ability for us to live stream and make this video, right, and put it on YouTube. So that's actual value that comes from the tech industry. Is the tech industry overvalued? That may well be, but a true bubble has no intrinsic value, right? It would be something like Squidcoin or some random crypto token, but tech is not one of those things. It does have actual intrinsic value. It just might be overvalued.
You mentioned a coin.
Yeah.
Don't understand Web3 and stuff. What is Web3?
Web3, okay, so people have many different definitions and interpretations of what Web3 is. Okay, to me, Web3 is mostly a marketing stunt. My basic understanding of Web 1, 2, 3, Web 1 was kind of the era where people ran their own servers and there were no standardized protocols or platforms. Web 2 delivered a better web experience by standardizing protocols and centralizing platforms. So this would be AWS and Google Cloud and all these centralized platforms where people can build off of standardized templates and libraries and use the same platform. And then Web 3 delivers the same quality or better quality experiences, but again allows you to do decentralized servers and run your own servers and platforms. And so the kind of innovation there is you get away from the centralized platforms, which capture a lot of the value in the digital economy. The problem with this is that if that's the definition you take of Web 2 and 3, then there is no reason to assign a cardinal number to 2 and 3. Both of those technologies have very valid use cases in the future of the internet and the digital economy. And it's not like one will replace the other, which is kind of what Web 3 tries to imply, that it will replace Web 2. Really, you can see both of those running side by side. There will be many apps and platforms where it just makes a lot more sense economically to use a centralized platform. And there will be others where it makes more sense to run your own server, right? The most important thing I think about Web3 is that it will not replace Web2. Decentralized platforms will not replace centralized platforms. Both centralized and decentralized platforms will exist in the future. There are valid use cases for having both. Centralization is not a bad thing. It typically is kind of painted as a very negative thing in the DeFi world, but centralization is not a bad thing. There's reasons why you do it. It basically turns trust into actual economic savings. So if you trust a centralized party, you actually get real economic savings and economy of scale out of it. And there are definitely use cases where that makes sense. Now, Web3, it has a lot of promising applications, of which I think very few of the cryptocurrencies does count as valid, very useful applications of Web3 technologies. And I don't even like the term Web3 technologies. I'm gonna start saying blockchain technologies. from now onwards. I don't like the term Web3. It's too much of that is marketing in my mind, and not enough is substance. Are you invested in any cryptocurrencies?
Just Ethereum.
Okay.
That
Are you even allowed to say that to your audience, or is that like
this
promoting?
is not financial advice.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Put a disclaimer out there. Yeah. Yeah.
I have invested in Ethereum before the crash, so I'm just waiting for it to go back up.
Yeah.
I think everyone is.
Yeah. I think Ethereum is a pretty solid token. I'm very bearish on Bitcoin, basically. Yeah, so I would not recommend Bitcoin.
Bearish?
Yeah. I think it's a very obsolete.
Are you invested in any coins?
Ethereum, Avalanche, Cardano, mainly those two. It was kind of like a competitor to Ethereum, another pretty good layer 1 protocol. For me, it's like, I think the layer 1 protocols have real intrinsic value. These are the actual blockchains on which decentralized applications are built. If you believe that blockchains have economic value, then you believe that in the future one of these will be dominant, or maybe all of them will exist and just have some share of the market. But regardless of which one dies out and which one doesn't, if you're invested, if you're diversified in all of the layer 1 protocols, then whoever remains, you would still have a higher return. And so long as the whole market grows in size, your investments will grow in size as well.
And how do you know which source is credible to learn all this stuff from? Where are the trusted sources?
The sources I like to go to, okay, so first off, just in life, a trusted source is someone that is not, you would have to evaluate first their kind of interests and check if they have conflicts of interest, right? So someone that's what's his name? Hodgson, the guy who founded Cardano, or Vitalik Buterin, for example, right? Yeah. So these people are pretty smart, both of them, but they're heavily invested in one project. So they have a conflict of interest, right? Like if Vitalik tells you to invest in Ethereum, you should take that with a grain of salt because he's financially incentivized to get you to invest in Ethereum. There's a conflict of interest there. Same with Hodgkinson, the Cardano founder. If he tells you to invest in Cardano, again, there's a conflict of interest there. It's like a car salesman telling you to buy a car from his lot. There's a fundamental conflict of interest. So those I typically don't consider trustworthy sources, or I trust their representations of the actual technical details because they don't want to be charged with fraud, but I take it with a grain of salt. The actual source, I think, the one I used was MIT's blockchain open courseware course on YouTube. So if you're going to invest in something, you should always try to understand the fundamentals about how it actually works. And if you were asked to explain what you've just invested in and why it has value, your answer cannot be something like other people think it has value. You should be able to fundamentally explain why this is a better product than its alternatives. And it cannot be something along the lines of it's more recognition. It has to be technical, right? And if you can explain with technical reasoning why it's better than alternative products, then you have a fairly good investment thesis to actually make a educated investment.
How is Ethereum technically better than other coins?
This is constantly in flux, and I haven't kept up to date with what is the actual technical details of Ethereum versus others. What is their... No, but I do know why they're better than Bitcoin, and I do know that all the other three, Avalanche, Ethereum, and Cardano, are proof of stake systems, and they're all fairly well built. The thing is that these things can always change in their costs. They're constantly being updated. They all have an active developer community. So whatever I tell you today may not hold true 2 months from now. But what will hold true is that they are already well ahead of Bitcoin, and their fundamental transaction validation protocol, which is proof of stake, is better than proof of work. I'm pretty confident in that statement.
What's the difference?
Yeah, so the way proof of work works is you basically get every compute node to guess the hash code that corresponds to the next block. So you have a bunch of transactions that are broadcast. The job of every node in the network, in the Bitcoin mining network, is to gather all those transactions, compile them into a block, and then once they do that, a hash code comes out. And they then broadcast that hash code. The hash code is hard to make because it's hard to put all those transactions in order and figure out what the balances ought to be. But once you have that hash code, it's very easy to check. So the cost to check is much lower than the cost to generate that hash code. Now, you have all of these nodes all of these miners that are concurrently trying to guess these hash codes, right? And the problem with that is that because it's completely trustless, no node trusts any other computing node. So what that means is it will, just by random chance, guess things that have already been guessed by other miners. And this is what leads to huge inefficiency. So if you double the mining power on a network, you double the number of compute nodes on the network, the cost of transactions roughly go up by an order of 2 as well. So it's like roughly linear, the correlation. And that's a problem, right? Because typically when you throw more compute at something, you would expect the cost to drop. You would expect it to be better at processing transactions, cheaper. But not the case for Bitcoin. It actually gets more expensive if you throw more compute into the network. And that's kind of the fundamental reason why it's obsolete. Proof of stake does not have that problem. Proof of stake gets around this by establishing some level of trust. So the trade-off in essence is trust versus cost. So in Ethereum, or in all proof of stake protocols, what you do is you have people that say, I'm willing to validate blocks. I'm willing to try in good faith to make new blocks. And what I'm going to do to show that I'm going to do this in good faith is I'm going to stake a portion of my own tokens. For example, let's just take Ethereum. You would stake Ethereum, right? And that means that you put that Ethereum into some wallet. You can't access it. And if you do, then you get the chance to be selected as a validator to go and validate the next block. If you get selected and you just follow the software and you validate the next block, everything's fine and you get paid a nice sum for doing that service. Okay? And it's random chance if you get selected. Now, if you were to try to falsify transactions to your own benefit, someone's going to detect it eventually because they're going to be missing money. They're going to be missing Ethereum tokens. And then they're going to challenge your validated block. And then the blockchain protocol will go back and look to see if what you actually did was correct, if your proposed block was correct. If it finds an error, it will deduct your stake. So your stake is locked away for a certain portion of time after you validate. And if you do a bad job at validating, you will lose more money because your stake will be partially confiscated. Basically, in essence, proof of stake, what it does is it forces validators to stake their own currency, to stake their own tokens. And so because their tokens are now potentially, they can be penalized, they are incentivized to act in good faith. Furthermore, if you have now a lot of proof of stake protocols make it very expensive for you to become a validator. They ask you to put up a very large amount of tokens as your stake. And the reason for that is what that forces you to do is, as a validator, you are heavily invested in that token. And if you're heavily invested in that token, you want to see that blockchain protocol work well so that your investment will grow over time. If that blockchain protocol does not work well, if there's constantly frauds and hacks and stuff like that, then your investment will drop in value. Because they force you to have a large stake in their token, you will try to make that blockchain work well, and you will try to act in good faith as a validator. So that's how proof of stake works. And so proof of stake, if you were to double the amount of compute on a network, the cost per transaction is actually constant because it's still the same number of validators. It's a very different scaling function than Bitcoin. Right? Proof of work, you have monotonic increases. So you increase compute, you increase cost per transaction. For proof of stake, you increase compute, it's the same cost per transaction. That's fundamentally the big difference. That's fundamentally why Bitcoin costs so much energy to maintain.
A lot of people hold it as a store of value.
I mean, a lot of people held Yahoo and AOL.
They also hold gold.
I don't think that analogy is a very apt analogy. So a lot of people compare Bitcoin to physical gold. I don't think those two are analogous. I think the main reason why they compare to gold is it's limited in mintage, just like gold is a limited amount of gold atoms on this planet. But the thing is, I can make a limited mintage cryptocurrency in 20 minutes. Does that mean that it also is as good as gold? No, right? Limited mintage does not equate to gold. It has to have intrinsic utility. Gold can be forged into jewelry. It can be used in electronics. Bitcoin does not have an intrinsic use case. It's used as a blockchain, but if nobody used it as a blockchain, or people found better things to use as blockchains, then there is no more intrinsic value left in Bitcoin. If people found other things to make jewelry out of, gold is still a competitor. It still has intrinsic use case.
you enjoyed this video and my talks with Han, let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you next time.